And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. It's available on Pacifica Radio Network and Progressive Radio Network and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud. And the complete archives are available at opednews.com/podcasts with an S. My guest for this show is Gary Rosenthal. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist with master's degrees in clinical psychology and transpersonal counseling, initially studying at the Jung Institute, Zurich. He's also the author of the book Revisioning Narcissism, Healing Heresies for Polarized Times. And his website is revisioningnarcissism.com. So you wrote to me and said that you were up for focusing on three narcissistic themes: why it's timely and necessary now to revision it, exploring the multiple ways it could be revisioned, and a more extensive evocation of some helpful things we can do to heal our own. And I want to start because you've done a neat job, and I never really encountered anything like it before, of exploring the history of narcissism in human history. So why don't you start with that? Tell us about that.
Okay, I think that's a great place to begin, Rob. And one of the things that I do in the book is there's a quote from, I think it's Aristotle, and he said that hubris, which was one of the main ways that the early Greeks conceived of narcissism, is perpetuated by those lacking in knowledge of history. So I thought it was fitting in the book to, in a sense, take a history of narcissism itself. And, narcissism was first recognized over 2,000 years ago by the Greek poets who gave us the myth of Narcissus and Echo, from which narcissism was named. And they initially tried to criminalize it. They saw it as a crime committed both against other citizens, but also as a crime against a spiritual crime. It's a crime against the gods, and perhaps for both reasons. They saw it as the central character flaw in the protagonists of ancient Greek tragic dramas.
Now you're talking about hubris.
Yeah, but that is like a central facet in narcissism. That was
What is hubris then?
It's like a prideful arrogance that shames, it's like inflation. It's like having a grandiose sense of yourself and a disparaging way of looking at others that lacks empathy. It is really, that was their take, their perception of the same thing that we call narcissism.
I know. When I think of hubris, I think of somebody who is kind of arrogant and overreaching.
Absolutely.
Thinks that they can get things or take things or do things that goes beyond what is appropriate.
Well, Donald Trump is a perfect example.
Okay.
But I feel you slightly being slightly resisting to see.
No, it's okay. I mean, we're talking history here, and we're talking about putting it into the context. I think it's fascinating to look at it that way, and that it was treated back then much more severely than it is now, really.
Yeah, and also even more than today, although we're getting closer to the Greeks, even more, they recognize it all over the place, just like we're starting to recognize narcissism all over the place now, but they've been looking at this for a long time. And one of the interesting things was, in terms of the history, that, I said that narcissism has been recognized by the early Greeks poets for at least 2,000 years, and also for over 2,000 years, the Greeks had, in the whole Mediterranean, the Greeks had something very significant. They had ritual events through which their myths became reenacted. And the most transformational of all of these mythic rites, these mysteries that were celebrated in the Mediterranean world, were the rites celebrated at Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries. And one of the interesting things about them, and these, by the way, this was the signal transformational ritual event. This was like their Woodstock, only with a more spiritual, even more spiritual emphasis. And this went on for 2,000 years. And we, in a way, don't really know much about the details of it, because revealing the details of this mystery was punishable by death. But what we do know about it is that there was a kind of ritual brew of the Kilian that was drunk. And we know that it had some element of barley in it and also pennyroyal. But what recent scholarship has plausibly concluded is that there were actually some kinds of some kind of psychotropic drugs that were administered as part of this. And it was, and we know that there had been in the Mediterranean world the practice of using various potions like this for spiritual events. And in this particular, in the Mysteries at Eleusis, we know that there was a fast that happened just before the ingestion of that. And we know that fasting before taking a drug can both increase its potency and its how quickly it kicks in. So these are ideal for collectively observed rites.
Well, what were the purposes of the Eleusinian myths? The Eleusis process or rituals? What were they doing? Were these initiation rituals? Were these rites of passage?
They were, yes, they were an initiatory rite. And I would say that our cult, pardon?
Into initiation into what?
Well, what it initiated people into, I think, this is my take, is that it initiated them into an experience of their own non-egocentric consciousness. Because one of the things that we do know is that they all reported that it lessened their fear of death. So something happened there that gave them a shift, an existential shift in the way they experience reality.
So what was the purpose of them? What were they, why did they do this? And you said that it went on for 2,000 years? Over
2,000 years, and it was the main transformational rite celebrated in the pre-Christian world. And in terms of the history, I want to jump into the Christian world thing, if we might.
Well, I just want to finish up with the Eleusinian.
Okay, I'm saying that there are a lot of things we don't know about it because you were not allowed to talk about it, about the pain of death. But what we do know is that the mythic background of it was an enactment of the myth of Pluto and Persephone. We know that. And we know, and
going Pluto into the underworld and coming back.
Yes, exactly. And Pluto, of course, was the Greek god of death who lived in the underworld. Persephone was abducted into the underworld by Pluto, and she would come back each spring. And the moment she came back, when she disappeared in the winter, all the crops would die. This is why we have winter in this mythological, view. And the moment she returned from the underworld and stepped back on the earth, at that moment we had the beginning of spring and the life force returns. That's the idea.
So didn't Joseph Campbell and Mircea Eliades also write about the Eleusinian?
Absolutely. Eliade in particular wrote a book entirely about this. And there also is a very good book that was published by North Atlantic Books called, I have it here somewhere.
We'll pull it up later.
I'll pull it up later. But anyhow, and that book, one of the co-authors is the guy who I think was the inventor of LSD, and he was the one who was making the connection between the rye and the barley grains and how LSD was first synthesized. And there are other people who have speculated that the entheogen might have been DMT, a psychedelic molecule that's formed from the mixing of two different plants. And the various plants that can be used were readily available in the Mediterranean world. And this is very similar to the two-part brews that have been made to create ayahuasca. And I myself have made these brews and can attest to their potency.
So this was not Christian. This whole ritual.
No, not absolutely. But the Christian element comes in here as part of the history of the narcissism thing, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
In 392, after 2,000 years of this being celebrated, in 392, there is a new Roman emperor, and he is the follower of a new mystery religion, Christianity. And he thought that the continued existence of these Eleusinian mysteries and the mythic figures that they're based on, that all of this would impede the spread of Christianity. So in 392, he abolished these rites, and within 4 years, the sites where transformational rites have been performed for over 2,000 years, they returned to rubble.
And who was that?
His name is Theodosius I.
Huh.
And it was not just the Eleusinian mysteries, it was all of those rites for the different deities in the Greek mythopoetic world. They were all just buried.
Well, there's a little bit more to that, though, because one of the reasons that the Roman Empire adopted Christianity was because the idea of it was to make the soldiers feel more powerful and potent. That the
but the Roman Legion, it was more the mythic religion that they were into. And basically Rome, the policy of Rome had been basically to not interfere with any of these different religious cults as long as they posed no political problems for Rome. And when Caesar went into Gaul, he actually observed the people there basically celebrating the same gods that had existed in the Mediterranean, in the Greek and Italy and Greece, only with different names, and it wasn't an issue. They didn't care about it. It was only if it posed some potential political problem.
Yeah, but my point is that the adoption by Rome of Christianity was for military war purposes. It was actually designed to make the soldiers more brave and more faithful to Rome.
Could be. I mean, that could correspond to something that Joseph Campbell said, which is from the 4th century on. That's the period we're talking, 392. Joseph Campbell said that from the 4th century on, Europe was essentially Christianized by sword point. That was his quote.
Right.
So you may be onto something right there.
Yeah, I've studied that a bit. So okay, so the other thing that we kind of glossed over a little bit is that you write that the Greeks tried to criminalize hubris.
Yeah, well, I mentioned it. I said they first considered it as a crime, both as a crime against other citizens. You could say somewhat akin to our impeachment trial of Trump. For the hubris, for the lack of empathy, for the arrogant way that they had been treated. But it was also seen as a crime against the gods, a violation of archetypal relations. And I'm saying that for both reasons, probably. Hubris was seen as the central character flaw for most of the protagonists in ancient Greek tragic dramas.
So do we have history of somebody being tried and punished for hubris?
I have no knowledge of that, but this is from my research, what I've said. I don't remember any examples being given, just that it was mentioned that this was the case.
Well, it raises an interest.
It would be interesting. It'd be a really interesting research project, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would be, because I've written a lot. I have.
I've noticed.
My series on psychopaths and narcissists, I've got over 90 different articles and interviews and transcripts. And I've written, I think that we need to identify who these people are, and as a way of protecting.
Who, what? I lost part of that.
I think we need to identify the people who are these narcissists and psychopaths who are predators. And
absolutely.
So we protect the population from them. And we're going to get more into that. And you
I want to. And one of the things that I'm especially excited to be talking with you, Rob, is because precisely because you yourself have researched and written so extensively on the topics that we're going to be talking with. So I'm not talking with somebody who doesn't have a clue. I really respect you, and I really respected. I had one quibble I mentioned in an email, but I really respected the article that you wrote last October. That was fantastic. And I totally concurred with the way that you conflated malignant narcissism with psychopathy and linked them to trunk. In fact, in your article, you even joined them as one phrase. I think you called it a malignant narcissistic psychopathy.
Yeah.
It was brilliant. And I totally was in agreement with that. And in fact, I would like to use that as a segue.
Well, let me just say the article, what I said in that article was basically that Trump, the worst disease that Trump has put upon the planet.
Absolutely.
It's horrible what he's done with COVID-19, and it's been suggested that it should be called the Trump pandemic or the Trump virus, because he has played such a role in making it so horrific. But I think that the worst, more long-lasting thing that he will have done to us is he has unleashed narcissism, malignant narcissism, and psychopathy.
That's frozen. The last sentence you said got frozen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I think that he has unleashed, by behaving in that way, people to think that they have the right to behave in malignant, narcissistic, psychopathic ways. And we're seeing that every day. We're seeing these Proud Boys and things like that that are really problematic.
Absolutely, and they're not going to go away. But I want to add one more thing into that. In addition to that, I think an equally profound impact of the pathology of Trump has to do with his attack upon our very democracy and his lawlessness, and that is very much a psychopathic feature. And there's something I really want to segue into here about this to expand it a little bit more.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I was saying that I really admired the way that you wrote, and I think very, very accurately wrote about malignant narcissism, and also the ways that you also included in that article quite a number of psychopathic traits. Yet there's something curious here to me as an American psychologist. And what it is in the official manual of American psychiatry, the DSM, there is absolutely no mention of malignant narcissism, nor is there any mention of any of the other narcissistic styles that I wrote about in the book. You can search through the DSM-5 wearing your Sherlock Holmes hat and having a magnifying glass, and you will not see the word psychopath. And that's because in 1980, as the third edition of the DSM came out, it elected to totally throw sociopaths out of the manual and to almost completely throw out psychopaths. You won't see the word, but there's still, even in DSM-5, there's a brief mention of psychopathy, but only in the alternative approach to personality disorders. It's not in the prevailing part of the manual.
But do you have a theory about why?
That is a good question that I haven't thought about.
Ah, all right.
Well, I understand it in one sense. I understand it in terms of
okay, then hold on. We need to take a break now for the show ID. When we come back, you'll get into that, okay?
Fantastic.
So we need to take a 25-second break now, and then I'll reintroduce you, and that gives me a space to pop in the bumper for the radio show.
Fantastic.
And my guest for the show is Gary Rosenthal. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist with master's degrees in clinical psychology and transpersonal counseling. And he's the author of the book, Revisiting Narcissism, Healing Heresies for Polarized Times. His website is revisioningnarcissism.com. Okay, so why did that happen? Why did they not include anything along those lines in the DSM-3, DSM-4, DSM-5?
There is a piece of investigative psychological journalism that I do in my book about that, tracing the whole evolution of the DSM. But what I would say is that from the third edition, first of all, what started out as how it evolved, how the DSM evolved to take on the antisocial personality disorder as its own brand, there's an article that you can find online that traces the evolution of this, and it's called Psychopathy and the DSM. It's about 10 pages only, and it's so dense that it took me like a day and a half to wade through it, taking notes on the way, but it was incredibly eye-opening. And I don't want to go into the weeds about this, but basically there were people on the personality disorder committee who wanted to come up with their own brand. And that's what they did. And they made it increasingly difficult to use any other brand. So you can't use sociopath in your diagnosis now. You can use antisocial personality disorder with a further clarifier that you could say with a psychopathic feature. But in order to even mention that, you have to not just jump through the three diagnostic criteria hoops in order to make the diagnosis of ASPD. You have to have 6 of the 7 to use something not their brand, and you also have to have the only 2 psychopathic traits that it expressly identifies, and those are to have a lowered degree of anxious withdrawal because you're so bold. You have a lessened degree of that, and then a heightened degree of attention seeking. If you have all that, if you jump through 6 of the hoops, you pass through, check off 6 of the criteria, and then jump through this further hoop, then you can even make a little mention of psychopathy.
But that's common. That's almost standard for a lot of the DSM-5. It lists all these different criteria in order to make the diagnosis.
Yeah, but there's no criteria for psychopath. There's no, you in your article have like maybe like 10. There's nothing like that about psychopaths. There is for antisocial personality disorder. There's, I think, like about, there's 7 of them.
Well, I cribbed.
You have more than that for the.
I kind of cribbed off of Robert Hare's.
Where did you crib?
From Robert Hare.
Well, he's the best source.
Yeah.
Absolutely, he's the guy to go to.
Yeah.
Also, his mentor, Hervey M. Cleckley, and he's very significant in terms of the evolution of the DSM and this way that they wound up banishing psychopathy. He wrote a very important book, Cleckley. It was called The Mask of Sanity. It occurred 11 years before the first edition of the DSM. And when the first edition of the DSM occurred, Cleckley contributed, along with other contributors who were all pursuing some kind of a sociopathic disorder that also had some antisocial features to it. So in the first edition, it's like all these guys writing. In the second edition, they started to zero down more on what Cleckley was saying. It became more framed in terms of, antisocial. And they used like him to be the source of writing about something that would later be called antisocial personality disorder. So they used the leading authority of a psychopath, and they begin to like subvert that into this sociopathic thing. By 1980, when the third edition comes out, there's like none of that. It's all they have their own brand now, and there's
the DSM, whatever number it is, it's basically a bunch of opinions by a couple of experts, supposed experts who meet in a hotel room somewhere and decide this is what we're going to say.
Absolutely.
There's no science to it. There's no research to it.
Absolutely. But that perspective that you have is actually very good. And what I found in my profession when I was going through grad school and whatnot, it was like the DSM was considered like the voice of Olympus or something. This is the definitive and ostensibly most comprehensive vision of these different forms of psychopathology.
Well, but it also drives commerce too. I mean, the DSM is used by insurance companies to determine
I know.
reimbursement, to determine how many sessions a person should get. It's very much driven by big health insurance companies as well.
Yeah, that's part of it. Anyhow, I mean, but it was a real eye opener for me to discover how inadequate it was, and to dethrone it, and I could talk more about that.
Well, wait, I just want to throw another piece in, because, I've been researching this for about 8 years now.
Yeah.
And that's about how long? Maybe 9. And one thing I discovered early on was that the FBI had done a kind of a symposium on it, and they had papers that they published.
On what?
Papers.
On what? On what?
On psychopathy.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things I've learned early on is, some people call it psychopathy, some people call it sociopathy, some people call it what is the other one with the social
antisocial personality disorder.
Personality disorder. So I go, the safest one, I think the most accepted one is psychopathy. So I use that and interchangeably with sociopath. But
here's the thing, Rob, there's a difference between them, and Hare is the one who most clearly differentiated.
All right, we'll get to that. I just want to finish my little shtick here. So I found this collection of articles. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
All right. So I found this collection of articles published by the FBI, and what they reported was that something like 30% of people in prison were psychopaths, and that the recidivism rate is just massive.
Yes.
But that's, of course, we know the dumb psychopaths are the ones that go to jail. The smart ones become heads of churches, that politicians, heads of corporations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one of the diagnostic.
Just to finish, you can't find that anymore. That article is gone. And to me, it was one of the most powerful ones, because it was a study showing just how bad the extent of psychopaths really is.
Absolutely. And so what I was going to say just there is that one of the diagnostic traits of psychopaths is the inability to learn from experience. That's part of the recidivism. They don't learn from experience. You can see that in Trump also. He doesn't learn from experience. He doesn't learn from history. He just keeps spinning his own.
That's interesting. I mean, they learn how to fake it. They learn how to have fake empathy. They learn how to get people to love them, and to be enamored with them, with their charisma, because psychopaths and narcissists are just brilliant at having charisma.
Yeah, and that's exactly why that's exactly why Cleckley titled his seminal book, The Mask of Sanity. They're wearing a mask, and Trump is wearing a mask all the fucking time.
Oh, watch that language.
Oh, sorry, I said the F word. I'm sorry. You warned me, and I forgot.
Yeah, that's all right. I'll have to bleep it out.
Oh, it'll be my first bleep all year.
I can leave it in for the YouTube, but I have to bleep it out for the radio show. So, Trump wasn't really very good at it. He's not. I mean, I guess he is charismatic because he's bamboozled 74 million people. I mean, or some of those. I mean,
that's so troubling.
I think that the people who voted for Trump, some voted against Biden and they voted against Democrats, but a lot of them just were enamored with Trump and they love him. I mean, I've had people I know say he's the best president in a lifetime. And I look at them, I go,
what planet are you living on?
You're out of your mind.
Right.
You become a cult member.
But that is the more trouble. Now that we finally have him voted out of office, that figure is looming to me in a very large way. You know, first of all, it just continues to astonish me that after his just unbelievable performance as a president, the way he handled the COVID pandemic, and his unrelenting series of lawless acts that even after all of that, I mean, in a normal political culture, just the Hollywood access tapes, him talking about grabbing the you-know-whats of women, that would have been enough to deep six any candidate for further having any kind of political future. But this guy has been impervious to that. So that 74 million people who, after this absolutely unbelievable performance, would still want 4 more years of that. That to me is just enormously troubling. Those people are not going to go away. And I don't know what to do about it. I mean, are we going to have another 4 years of that kind of obstructionism that's made America almost ungovernable?
Yeah. So I started this off. You had sent me an email saying you wanted to focus on 3 narcissistic themes: why it's timely and necessary now to revision it, exploring the multiple ways it can be revisioned, and a more extensive evocation of some helpful things we can do to heal our own. Do you believe that people can be healed of narcissism?
I do. And my experience of being a psychotherapist and my experience of being myself is that it's not an easy fix. Yeah, you can. And I want to also clarify something that may be a point of difference between us. I think that there's, first of all, a difference between somebody who has a full-on narcissistic personality disorder and someone who may have narcissistic features. And it's my take, Rob, is that just living in this culture, it's like living in a culture where there is a kind of virus rampant, and it is a narcissism virus. And so it's hard to be in this culture and to not have a little bit of narcissism in us. And I think that one of the tendencies people have done is to kind of externalize it and to only see it as a problem of those people or that president, which I say is could be a case of the pot calling the kettle black. And it's my belief that we all have, in this day and age, we all have a bit of char in our pot.
I wouldn't argue with that. No, I think that once you've got somebody who meets the criteria for just being described as a full narcissist, they're predators.
Well, that's another point of distinction that I would make. It's the one place in your article where we parted ways. I was saying, yeah, all the time I was reading it until we got to that last bit. And so here's what I would say about that. I would say, first of all, as I said earlier, that I thought that your perception of malignant narcissism was absolutely spot on. But not all narcissists are malignant. So I talk about 5 different styles in my book.
Ah, okay.
And so not all of them are, I mean, because you painted them all with one brush, and I wouldn't do that.
Well, then enlighten us.
Okay.
5 styles.
So I'm gonna just.
I will also throw in that every psychopath is a narcissist.
Absolutely, agreed. I agree with you on that.
So 5 styles of narcissists. Let's hear them.
Okay, give me a minute. And I'm going to tell you, in my book, this is a whole chapter, and I've made some notes here to make it much abbreviated. Give me a second. Okay.
You know what? I'm going to take a brief another show ID now while you're checking that
Good,
out.
I found it, but go ahead.
Okay.
So you're going to take the break now?
Yeah, I need 25 seconds of silence.
Okay, good.
My guest for the show is Gary Rosenthal. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist with master's degrees in clinical psychology and transpersonal psychology. He's the author of the book, Revisioning Narcissism, Healing Heresies for Polarized Times, and his website is revisioningnarcissism.com. Okay, so you're going to tell us about 5 different categories of narcissists.
Yeah, I was saying earlier in our talk that you can't paint them all with one brush. It's not all one brush. It's not all one style, and that there's an enormous difference between someone who's a malignant narcissist, which is basically the same as being a psychopath, and the other forms of it. So in my book, there's a whole chapter. It's called the 5 Faces of the Narcissistic Curse, and 4 of the styles are very well represented by Dr. James Masterson. He's dead now, but for years he was regarded as sort of like a leading source for what psychology sometimes refers to as disorders of the self, another words for personality disorders. And especially he was very good, I think, on narcissistic disorders. And he didn't recognize 5, he recognized 4. And the last one that he came to recognize is what has been termed the devaluing narcissist. I'm going to give you very just brief thumbnails of this, just to give you a sense. So the devaluing narcissist sort of has a haughty way of looking at others. Like everybody else is sort of second rate and don't meet their standards. So let's say Meryl Streep in The Devil Wears Prada would be a good example of a devaluing narcissist. Or maybe the role Donald Trump played in his series, The Apprentice. You're fired. And a second narcissistic style is when this haughty critical view gets turned against the self, leading us to feel kind of empty and shabby in some way, anxious and depressed and unfulfilled. In Buddhist psychology, this is termed the realm of the pretas, or the realm of the hungry ghosts, who iconographically are portrayed as having like enormous bellies and throats no wider than a needle. So this is a state where some kind of fulfillment feels structurally unavailable, structurally unfillable. I can't feel this hunger. I'm a hungry ghost. And it corresponds to what Masterson terms empty unit narcissism. And so people who suffer from empty unit narcissism often turn to drugs, or maybe erotic relationships used like drugs, to feel this underlying emptiness. The third style, in the third style, the fusion with this inner critic that we saw in devaluing narcissism could take a slightly different form, whereby the strategy becomes that of trying to hide the shame sense of self. Anytime that we're feeling like wincing, cringed, and withdrawn. Here we've introjected an earlier rejection by someone else, and now it lives inside us. So a good example of that would be in the myth of Narcissus and Echo would be Echo. In her myth, after Narcissus rejects her, she retreats into lonely valleys and forest caves. Here we feel vulnerable to exposure and seek distance from the eyes of others, for we assume that they be looking at us the way we're secretly looking at ourselves. And this style is what Masterson terms closet narcissism. So, and I think it's probably the most common form. It's what I see most commonly in therapy clients. I almost never encounter like a malignant narcissist, but I see an awful lot of closet narcissists. And though closet narcissism is perhaps the least known form today. And it's also the least pernicious. I mean, they're not out there, arrogantly, boldly, smashing down the culture or something. They don't want to be exposed. I feel vulnerable. Like because I don't know if I can trust the world to receive me.
One of the things I've come to believe is, narcissists create narcissists in terms of parents and children.
Absolutely.
My guess is that you just described the empty unit narcissist and the closet narcissist. They're children of perhaps more malignant narcissists who've been damaged.
What I would totally concur with the first part of what you just said, that people who are current narcissists are often the children of narcissists. And you can certainly see that in Trump, But the point is, in all of these styles, I would say, even this more cringing closet narcissism, they all are the result of growing up in a family where your true nature is not empathically recognized and supported. It feels like that's not enough. I either have to be grandiose to get any attention, or since I'm not going to be recognized, I'm just going to cringe around and just assume the rest of the world is going to see me the same way my parents did. So it's going to impede my capacity to connect with other people.
Now, my impression is that for a narcissist, all the air in the room is for the narcissist. There's no air left for anybody else.
That's a good depiction, but I think not of all narcissists. And the closet narcissists, they're not like that. They're not talking all the time. They're hiding more. They would like to be, but they're more hesitant.
Okay, and then you said there are 5 altogether.
Yeah, we've talked about 3. So the 4th one is the one that most commonly comes to mind, I think, when we talk about narcissism, and it's what Masterson termed exhibitionistic narcissism. Here, rather than hiding in a closet, we instead try to pump ourselves up so as to appear larger than life. Now we see other people as our needed audience, an audience who might reflect our grandiose and ideal self and idealized self-image in all its glory. So here, of course, a good example would be Donald Trump appearing at a rally in front of his base. Or Hollywood is like a domain of exhibitionistic narcissism, with this flagrant display of wealth, and where people want to go to become stars and have the desire to see their face on billboards, or perhaps, as with Trump, on the face of Mount Rushmore. At his golf clubs at one point, Trump once sent fake covers of Time magazine with his face on the cover. And he's also given himself what golfers term a Hollywood handicap. You know what that is?
No.
It's like, in golf, the lower your handicap, the better you are. So most of the people that I know who've actually played with him say he's pretty good. He has maybe a 9 or a 10 handicap, but he tells people he has a 3 or a 5. And he's also touted himself as the winner of many club championships in which he's never even actually competed, So that's the exhibitionistic. And
well, you just described the liar. Is this exhibitionist also?
In a sense, they all are living a lie. The self-image that they're identified with, there's something not accurate about it. You're not really this grandiose self, and you're not this cringing little worm. These are false identifications. So in a sense, narcissism is a case of identity confusion. It's an identity confusion. You're taking yourself to be what you're not. So it could take the guise of being fraudulent, it often does, say with Trump, but it could also take the guise of taking yourself to be, no one's gonna get me. No one's gonna get me. It sucks here. I wish I could be out there more and connect, but I just don't have the confidence.
There's this group of men who never can be with women. I forget what you call them. They're, I can't think of it. They're
Catholic priests or what?
No, they're, they don't have any sex. What's the word for not having sex? I can't think of it. But they've actually created like a culture and community online. And so they resent women and they hate women. Some of them have actually gotten violent. I wonder if they fit under that category of the empty unit narcissist.
Well, the empty unit tends to see, you feel empty inside, but then you want to go out and appropriate something to fill your emptiness. I'll take a drug, or I'll use sex or relationships to get my dose that fills my emptiness.
So there are narcissists that will exploit women. This is very common.
Well, of course.
Could any of these be those narcissists?
Yeah, the one we were just talking about could. The empty unit could, but also could the exhibitionistic, and so could the malignant.
Which makes them all predatory.
No, it doesn't necessarily make them all predatory. I think there's a difference between the predatory nature of a malignant narcissist and people who feel empty inside and want to get a hit that fulfills them.
No,
There's a difference.
maybe, but it's
It could be. I mean,
maybe I think the malignant narcissist is more aggressively that way, but it sounds to me like maybe the psychodynamics of their predations are different, but it leads to them being predatory.
yeah, I mean, but are you predatory when you're hungry for something and you go buy something at Safeway?
No, but I'm not hurting anybody when I do that. If I get into a relationship so I can take the woman's money and use her credit card up, that's
Yeah, but that's more like malignant, you know. I don't see that necessarily as being exhibitionistic or empty unit. Yeah. So, but one of the things I was saying, I don't want to get lost in the shuffle, is that one of the things that all of these styles have in common is the loss of one's own true nature. And that leaves a hole in the soul that narcissistic supplies can never fill. And I would also say that exhibitionistic narcissism is very, very big on narcissistic supplies. The sports world has always recognized this style as hot dogs, those with a special craving to be seen as special. In pro football, it seems more evident in, say, star wide receivers, perhaps the game's most narcissistic position, and those most prone to violate one of the cardinal principles of coach speak, namely, there is no I in team. So, you know, maybe contemporary exemplars would be someone like maybe Antonio Brown or Odell Beckham Jr., if you're a sports fan, you know.
So what's the fifth one?
The fifth one is malignant narcissism, and it's the only one of these styles not recognized by Masterson. And I spend about 15 pages in the book really giving it a thorough going over. But Rob, since you captured it so well and more economically in the article you published in October, would you start by giving us some of the central nuances of malignant narcissism as you understand it? And then maybe I'll try to fill in a little bit.
Well, I don't have the article in front of me, but
that's my problem too, you know.
Yeah.
We're so brilliant when we can write, you know.
Well, my writing includes doing research and reviewing my sources and my other notes and what have you. I also write about it in my book, The Bottom-Up Revolution, because I think that narcissism evolved with civilization. I mean, I think that before there was civilization, people lived in hunter-gatherer bands, even before tribes. And there people took care of each other. It was the nature of being in a tribe. To survive, you had to do that. And I think that with civilization, you developed this much more top-down way of seeing the world, which gave power over. Now there's power with, which is a healthy kind of power. And then there's power over, where you're dominating other people. And right. I think that narcissism evolved and came into humanity through that. I in my conversations with experts in anthropology and psychopathy, what I learned was that people who were narcissistic in a hunter-gatherer band or an indigenous culture
became the leaders often.
Well, what they said was they would be thrown out. They would be treated as insane, or they would be ejected. Mm-hmm. The Inuit up in the north would.
Although we've seen plenty of examples of the. I think I agree with that, but there've also been plenty of examples of the other, where the more narcissistic ones wind up being the leader of the cult.
Well, but that's in modern society. I'm talking about indigenous cultures.
Yeah. Could be.
So. I agree. And I was told that the Inuit might put the guy out on an ice floe, which is basically killing him.
Well, I think that we've seen that a lot in earlier cultures, where if you get a bad king, you know, you exile him or you kill the king, you know.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that anything like that should be done, but should be done. Something should be done when you know that somebody is that narcissistic to a psychopathic level. Then something should be done. We need to do something, and it's fascinating to me that the Greeks actually dealt with it. I would love to have some examples of how they actually identified people who did that and what happened to them. I mean, yeah. I would think that, you know, in the military, it's probably something that is not tolerated. If somebody acts on ego it cost people's lives. It cost soldiers' lives. And
that brings up an interesting point. I think that with the exception of the military, where there really is some kind of initiatory rite in the boot camps and whatnot, and especially where the martial energy is really promoted, the warrior energy, I think that one of the things that our culture suffers from is the loss of initiatory rites. But both Mircea Eliade that you wrote about and Joseph Campbell had talked about that. And that's contributed, I think, to the fact that we have a lot of sort of adult uninitiated children today, adult children.
Well, you know, I mean, I'm kind of a little surprised that even in early Christianity, there wasn't some kind of initiatory rites. You know, Christianity was massively changed when the Romans took over. You know, the other emperor who was very involved with adopting Christianity was Constantine.
Absolutely, he was earlier. That's when the like 324 rather than 394. You know, it's like that was the beginning, and that's when Christianity first became codified as an official doctrine. Until then, there have been many different competing kinds of Christianity, Jewish Christianity, Gnostic Christianity. But after the Council of Nicaea in 324, 325, it changed, and now there's official version of it. And it was Constantine's mother that was really more the main Christian in the family, but he was influenced by her. But with Theodosius I, things really begin to change. And
I was going to mention the Council of Nicaea because that's where they threw out a lot of the more esoteric aspects of Christianity, and they're not gone.
Exactly.
They just got thrown out of the Bible.
Right, but they've been retained, I think, in the Greek Orthodox Church bit. You know, I think it's you can still find the remnants of it, and you know, and also there are other Catholic sects, monastic sects that have been good about maintaining some of the more mystical parts. But one of the reasons I wanted to, I haven't gotten to any of the things I wanted to talk about, in part because
better get on it then.
Well, we have like 7 minutes and there's no time for it. So I think I can, but it's okay. I've really enjoyed being in a conversation with you.
Well,
Rob.
I want to understand about the revisioning.
And
I want to understand about the revisioning. So you got some time, get started on it.
Well, everything I've been saying has been part of a revisioning. And I think a revisioning is also very necessary when the current edition of the DSM-5 is in its low end estimate saying that the prevalence of narcissistic personality disorders in the American population could be as low as 0%. That doesn't jive with my experience of what's walking in my therapy room. And it also doesn't jive with the longest running study of narcissism ever conducted in America, which began in like early mid 1980s, went on for almost 20 years by a group of social psychologists with American college students. And over the approximate 2 decades, they noticed that narcissism had increased 30% in terms of the students being interviewed. And by the study's end, 2/3 of the students were scoring highly on a narcissism index. And those folks are now in their mid 30s to mid 50s. And that much more closely approximates what I've been seeing walking into my therapy office. And the juxtaposition of these two figures, 0% on the one hand, 2/3 on the other, the conclusion that I would make is if this 0% is what psychological orthodoxy is trying to tell us, then that's even more evidence of the fact that we're now badly in need of a more heretical revisioning of what narcissism really is. And that's what I was going to talk about in the second big block of time. In the third block of time, I was going to talk about what heals narcissism. And maybe we'll just have to come back for another.
No, let's keep going because we do some editing on this. We can go a little over on the video and I'll edit it down for the radio. So just go on then. How does this need to be done?
You want me to? Well, I have this whole thing lined up. I was going to talk more about different ways of revisioning, different ways of looking at narcissism, different ways of defining it, that there's not just one.
Go for it.
Okay.
So you've got a vision of how to revisualize narcissism. Go for it.
Yeah, but the revisioning happens in everything I write about everything I write about it. But I'm just talking now about different ways of defining it.
No, go for it.
Okay, so well, first of all, you have to have like some kind of introductory conversation about personality disorders in general. And you know, I would start with the more I would say that there's no correct, there's no, as Fareed Zakaria says each week, here's my take. Just as there's no single correct way to tell or interpret any myth, there's no one single way to define narcissism. And if we think there is, that could be a form of the kind of psychological fundamentalism I'm trying to throw to the frogs in my book. So in my book, I evoke it in several ways. And the most orthodox way, no surprise, is that reflected by the DSM. And the DSM considers narcissism as one of the 10 personality disorders. And each of these deviate from what is normative in the culture, often in disturbing ways. For one of the disturbing things that I think the DSM correctly sees about personality disorder, folks, is that if you have a personality disorder, seldom, if you have one personality disorder, seldom do you manifest only that one and that one alone. So that's a very important, helpful definition here. You know?
What are some of the other personality disorders?
Paranoid personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. There are 10 of them. I think I just named about 5 or 6.
Okay.
But anyhow, all of these are seen as, and so, you know, in the discussion that we've been having about Trump, we're actually we're kosher, we're legit in the eyes of the DSM, because we're recognizing that Trump is both a narcissist and a psychopath, right? We're down for that. I also, in my book, like reflect the ways that he may also be like a paranoid personality disorder with all these conspiracy theories, and he may actually like cohere with what's his name? Was it Halberstadt, the guy who wrote the paranoid nature of American politics? It was this 1964 essay, Halberstadt. 1964, right after Barry Goldwater had lost the presidential election, he wrote this. And one of the interesting things he said about people who are like this is that they have a persistent affinity for bad causes rather than good. And you can see that almost unwaveringly with Trump. If he's touting something, it's probably a bad cause.
Yeah.
Anyhow, back to the DSM, each of these personality disorders tends to be inflexible and deeply hardwired into the personality structure. In other words, they're not episodically suffered the way some of us suffer our issues. They're just, you know, deep in the hardwiring of these people. And the inception of these personality disorders usually become visible by adolescence or early adulthood. And they're considered to be, personality disorders are considered to be more pathological in the view of the DSM than the rest of us ordinary neurotics, yet they're not as delusional as those deemed psychotic. So it's this mid-range. In its portrayal of narcissistic personality disorder, the DSM-5 gives us a list of what are ostensibly its 9 diagnostic criteria. And I'll read them to you in a minute if you like. And when I do, since we've been talking about Trump, and since Trump has been widely diagnosed in the media as a textbook exemplar of NPD, our audience could do their own scoring from home. So here's
do it quick.
Yeah, I'm rushed here. I mean, you know, these are large. One of the things I appreciate about your shows, there's so much time, and our conversation's been just so great that we haven't gotten to these things, and it's okay. People can buy my book if they want to read it.
Well, but I want to get the brief idea of your idea of how to revision narcissism. And
well, I'm starting with the most orthodox. You can read what the DSM says about narcissistic personality disorder on page 146.
of your book? Or
No, in 146 in my book, but there's about 2 or 3 pages on it in the DSM, which is a horribly dry left-brained affair written by committee. And for that reason, they're often like things that don't jive. They'll say one thing, and then like a few pages later, especially in Narcissism, it'll say something else that contradicts it. It's not a wise book.
But I got to focus you. I want you to give me some ideas of how you are revisioning narcissism. So focus on that. I know you got a whole agenda there, but I'm in charge of this interview, so I need.
Okay, the question on the table is, how do I revision narcissism?
Yes.
And the way I start is by letting go of past and future and learning to use my eyes in a very objective way, the way a movie camera would scan whatever it's looking at, and learning to listen the way a tape recorder would listen, very objectively with no filter. So I just get really very as unnarcissistic as I can get and as established in my own presence. And from there, I say or do whatever comes to me.
I'm not clear. You're talking about how you're working with a patient, it sounds like.
You ask me, how do I begin to revision it? And I say, I start with myself. I get myself as unnarcissistic as I can do. And then I say or do whatever comes to me.
You almost sound like you're engaging in hypnosis with the pacing of your voice. It sounds like an Ericksonian conversation.
Well, it actually, you're correctly seeing something there. There actually is a shift in consciousness that I make. And this shift is what all the spiritual traditions attempt. And I say is part of what happens in the various gazes that I talk about in the book that approximate a more mystical way of looking at what Narcissus experienced when he gazed into that pool, because we were told by Tiresias that he would live to a ripe old age unless he truly came to know himself. And there is this deeper self element that's very different than the self-image that we take ourselves to be. And learning how to make that shift is very crucial in the transformation of narcissism.
So you are able to use that kind of an approach to help narcissists?
Yeah, because I teach them how to do the same, how to get more objective, how to step back. And I also have to reflect all the kind of bogus parts of their self-image and the bullshit they're still doing. You have to be able to reflect the pathology, but also have to show them what the opposite looks like. And that's largely, that's largely what Western psychology has lacked. And it's been the case ever since something very important happened in the early 20th century, about 100 years ago, as it was trying to establish, this is part of the history thing that we're starting on, that as part of its attempt to establish itself as a legitimate medical and scientific discipline, it effectively divorced itself from the world's great spiritual and religious traditions. And it's understandable. And I have on my website, I talk about why that was an understandable move. But unfortunately, I believe the legacy of that has lingered ever since in main-term psychology. And I don't think that narcissism can be cured without some spiritual element in the cure. If you're just looking at everything from the psychopathic point, the pathological point of view, you're not able to help people find the thing that's the opposite of that.
And you know, one of the reasons that I was into interviewing you is because you do transpersonal therapy.
Yeah.
And transpersonal therapy integrates the spiritual and the mystical.
That's exactly right.
Psychotherapy.
That's exactly right. Of course, it's a bit of a bastard because when someone says that they're a transpersonal therapist, it will definitely include what you just said. But you don't know what it could be. A hodgepodge. Are they teaching like some kind of put this gem on your third eye and suddenly you'll become enlightened? I mean, there's all kinds of questionable stuff, as well as the possibility of importing some of the really great stuff that are religious and spiritual traditions, the technologies they have developed over thousands of years. And so, yes, I try to bring both the clinical thing and also these spiritual things into my work. And, you know, before I ever became a psychologist, I had been a Buddhist monastic. I had studied with great meditation teachers as well as great psychologists. I was studying at the Jung Institute when I was before I could vote. I met my first Zen teacher the year I met my first Jungian analyst. And so for me, psychology and spirituality have never been separate. I've always seen them as just two parts of the same inner work.
And that really can help a narcissist, a malignant narcissist.
I'm not saying that anything can help malignant narcissists. They may be beyond the pale.
All right. So you're talking about the other four categories.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm not even sure I'm not going to write that in stone that they can't be healed. I mean, I just got through, for much of Trump's administration, I was binge watching The West Wing just to have some semblance of what an alternative political reality might look like. I needed it, And then recently, I just finished binge watching Dexter, who is a psychopath. And yet, there had been a way. He had worked with his father had worked with a psychologist, and they really knew what he was. And yet there was a kind of like education and training. He was taught this code that it was, they realized they couldn't stop him from killing, but they trained him to only kill people who deserved it, who the cops weren't getting to, So when you said to me, there really ought to be some way of, dealing with these people, identifying them and stopping them, two things came to mind, is that memory of Dexter, but also my own fantasy life. I had fantasy. I'm a golfer. Trump's a golfer. I've had fantasies. What happened if I just happened to have a gun in my golf bag when I saw Trump, and for a moment I had the opportunity? I would have seriously considered shooting him. I knew it would be the end of my life as I knew it, but I thought it would be really a heroic act and something good for the rest of the culture.
All right, we're going to have to pull that from the show. Can't put that on the air.
Okay. Thank you. Probably in my own best interest that you do that.
Yeah.
I appreciate it, Rob.
I know that from personal experience of a similar thing that I put out there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I wrote something, and the next thing I know, I get a call from the Capitol Police. So.
No shit.
Well, you did it again, but
I didn't. I knew you couldn't use the F word, but even the S word.
Yeah. All right, so I do need a wrap, so I can edit somewhat, but I'm going to run out of time here soon. So, what are some things that can be done to heal?
It's that's the longest spiel I had prepared for you, Rob. That's a 10-minute riff.
No, try to reduce it down to 2. You can do it.
Well, I've already evoked one thing that you can teach people is to come more to their senses.
How do they do that?
To begin by sensing your arms and legs, and then to add the auditory sense and to listen, as I was saying, the way a tape recorder would listen.
So like guided imagery of the body, body awareness.
It's more focusing. Most people are a little bit dissociated from their body. It's using the senses. Everybody has them. Using that to get more present.
Okay.
And to make that shift that you saw me making, that you thought was like related to hypnosis,
What else?
I think that people are hypnotized, and you have to give them means to get dehypnotized.
Okay, that's that. Okay, keep going.
So you can do that. And are you wanting me to talk as a therapist, or well, one of the things people can do is they can go on wilderness retreats. Like one of the great initiations for me happened when I got this amazing job being the fire lookout ranger on top of Smarts Mountain in New Hampshire. And I spent sometimes I go 10 days without seeing another person, and it helped show me how much of my neurotic bullshit was socially determined. For without other people around, I kind of fell into my more innate state. And human beings have always gone on wilderness retreats as a way of disengaging from some of the cultural bullshit that you just take on by virtue of living in a culture. So that's very important. But it's also important to have some kind of community where your own more authentic beingness is recognized and supported, so that's very important. I think that taking care of a pet can be anti-narcissism training. You have to put your needs aside. A dog can't take himself to the vet or buy his own kibble. So you have to be able to kind of empathically intuit what your dog is needing, which will help you to know what your dog is saying when it barks, or what a plant is saying when it wilts. In fact, when Gurdjieff was once asked, how am I going to learn to have more loving relationships? He said, start with plants and animals. They're easier.
It's notable that Trump was one of the few presidents
who never had a dog. Yeah. So it would have been a good training for him. So anything that helps. So those things help. And what else would I say? Being a good parent or a good friend is anti-narcissism training, and being a good single parent may be advanced training.
And we need a wrap.
Okay. Well, it's been an amazing conversation with you, Rob. I could have talked to you for 3 hours.
We could, I'm sure.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this conversation. And so will I be able to get a copy of this?
Hold on, we're not done. So,
okay. Are we done now with our taping?
In a minute.
Okay.
My guest for the show has been Gary Rosenthal. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he's the author of the book, Revisioning Narcissism, Healing Heresies for Polarized Times. His website is revisioningnarcissism.com. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. So